Bon dia, Cordia. Hi, everyone. Eimear Burke here. Welcome to another Fireside Chat. And this is Fireside Chat 159. And as is customary in these chats, I begin with a prayer for peace. Gomara Siacán ar fud na crinne. Gomara Siacán in our jaili agus in our jirha. Gnairi lin lenar cuid garamacha. Gamwij buichas jiv, jay chivdaka is spirit quivdaka. May peace prevail on earth. May peace prevail in our homes and in our countries. May our missions be accomplished. We thank you, guardian spirits and guardian deities, for peace. As the fever of day calms towards twilight, may all that is strained in us come to ease. We pray for all who suffered violence today. May an unexpected serenity surprise them. For those who risk their lives each day for peace, may their hearts glimpse providence at the heart of history. That those who make riches from violence and war might hear in their dreams the cries of the lost. That we might see through our fear of each other a new vision to heal our fatal attraction to aggression. That those who enjoy the privilege of peace might not forget their tormented brothers and sisters. That the wolf might lie down with the lamb, that our swords be beaten into plowshares, and no hurt or harm be done anywhere along the Holy Mountain, with thanks to John O'Donoghue. So, let me see where you're all from. So, Kyiv, my goodness, you're very, very welcome. And Northern Arapaho, Eastern Shoshone and Cheyenne, Wyoming, lovely. Canada, South Devon, sunny Pacific. Oh, I'll tell you, autumn is set in here, I'm afraid. And you can see I'm wrapped up in a coat. I'm not putting the heat on yet. I'm determined to wait a little bit longer before I put the heating on. So somebody from Eureka, that's California. Belfast, lovely. Central Ireland, wonderful. Southern California, Utah, wonderful to see all you people. Wait a second. West Yorkshire, Ulster, hello Pat. Calgary, wonderful. It's amazing. I'm always impressed with it. So we've got Kyiv on one side of the world, and then we've got North America, Canada, and the US as well. Sunny Pacific, or that's the Pacific. Great. West Surrey, lovely. New York. Where else have we got people from? Just lovely to see you all. Brighton, lovely. Bayside, California. Gloucester, Brazil, lovely. Tennessee, Brittany, Norfolk, New Brunswick, and Canada. High River, Canada again, and County Armagh, and Phoenix, and Bunclody. That's lovely. Bunclody's not far from where I am, and Oregon. You're all so, so welcome to this Fireside Chat. So we are going to Portugal this evening, and let me introduce my guest this evening. And it is Matt Baker. Matt, you're so, so welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here tonight.
Okay, and judging from your accent, it's obviously you're not Portuguese, but you're from the US. So tell us, what are you doing in Portugal?
That's a good question. Yeah, so originally from the East Coast of the United States, then lived in Phoenix for 30 years, in Arizona. And then after retirement, decided to move to Europe. I always wanted to live in Europe. I've been part of OBOD since 1993 or 94. And so I was looking around for where's a really wonderful place that has a strong sort of Celtic and ancient background. And Porto has the kind of weather I was looking for. It's right on the coast. It's beautiful. And it's kind of like two cities. There's an upper city and a lower city. And so my wife and I moved here. And then it turns out there are a whole bunch of other Americans who've moved here. And we've made some remarkably wonderful friends, both Portuguese and American. So it's been a really wonderful surprise, actually.
That's wonderful. I've never been to Portugal. So,
yeah.
And yet we have, and quite a number of Portuguese members, but it's on my list, but as lots of other places too.
Well, you're welcome to visit here anytime. Porto's in the north. Lisbon's kind of in the middle of the country, and Porto is itself it's the second city of Portugal. And it has its own character and its own, it's one of the few places on the earth that has never been conquered, which is really interesting. And they have a,
you mean a name for themselves. You mean Portugal or Porto?
Porto itself. And they have a name Invictus, which means invincible, basically. And
How did it avoid if part of it, if other parts of Portugal had been conquered? What was it about?
savvy diplomacy, and also kind of being in the right place at the right time, and also a couple women who are really important. One of the things that's really interesting about this particular city is and I didn't know this until I got here. Obviously, it's a Catholic country, and there's some wonderful, incredible churches covered with beautiful blue tiles. But as I began to visit these churches, I noticed church after church, I would come to the altar and kind of check it out, and there would be the, Mary, Queen of Heaven in the front, behind the altar, like a huge thing. And I was like,
Okay.
well, that's nice. Then I would go to the next one, and it'd be another one, and then it'd be a next one, and be another one. And then I started noticing that the way the overall culture here is very sort of, it has traditional old agricultural values, but the way women are treated in general is just different. There's a
Wow.
subtle kind of, I hate to say it, but there's almost like, I'd love to say it in a sense that there is this kind of subtle respect and power that the feminine divine archetype has here.
Wow.
And deep in the history of Porto, there is a woman who was in charge, who helped make it so that once again it didn't get invaded. I'll let you guys do the research on that yourself.
Oh, come on. Do that. Tell us a little bit.
Just that, there's the women have played a really important role here in Porto from the beginning, and all the way back to the Romans and all the way through. And so there's just a different energy here, and it's not just me noticing it. I mean, the women I've met here and notice that the way when they walk down the street, things are a little bit different than other places they've been.
Wow.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, there are a number of comments here but usually they're mostly about port.
Of course, that's the other part. Of course, the wine here and the port here are remarkable and incredibly good. There's such an abundance of wine in Portugal in general that they don't know what to do with it all. So
Wow.
yeah, it's kind of crazy. Yeah, wine is a little bit like water here. It's amazing. Actually, wine here is often cheaper than water in other places. So
Wow.
you can get really expensive water in London, right?
Yes, you can,
Yes,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's cheaper than bottled water here is more expensive than petrol, and it
Yeah.
has been for years. It's really interesting.
Yeah, crazy.
So Sean McCann says he knows what to do with all the wine. Bless you, Sean.
Right.
But so I know. So I don't know how big Porto is.
Couple 100,000.
So what's your landscape like? Thinking as a druid,
it's a good question.
How do you engage with your landscape?
So what I love about this place is, so imagine let's say you're just coming from across the ocean, whether you're coming from the United States or the south or the north, and you would come to the edge of Europe, really,
Yep.
and what you would come to is this beautiful sort of beaches just stretching backwards and up and down the north, and then there's a bay and a river, and it goes in. And so it's not like a big, huge delta or anything. It's a pretty straightforward river, and the water's going in and out every time. So there's lots of seagulls, there's lots of fish going in and out all the time. And then as you get in, there's kind of these cliffs on either side that begin to rise up in these hills. And then about, maybe a 20-minute walk, 10-minute walk in from that, inlet, the city begins to sort of appear on either side. So it's really a city that perches, there's two cities on either side of the river. And then the river goes up into the mountains and eventually goes into Spain, actually. And then far enough up, here's what's really ironic is that along the way, there's plenty of water here. So you have all these rain all the time and hills and water, and it's all going down into the river. And the further you get, it starts to look, say, kind of like Sonoma Valley or something, where you have all these vineyards on either side. And people are normally accustomed to thinking that, oh, it's the port that comes from here. It's like, yeah, port comes from here. But it's mostly a country that's making enormous amounts of just regular red and white wine. And there's all these different blends in these major grapes that they've had for a very long time. And sometimes they have vineyards where they don't even know what the grapes are, the types. Just the people who live there and have worked it for so long know how to blend it to create a very specific kind of taste. So it's really beautiful. And then so that's all happening, it's sort of, and you have these terraced hillsides. So that has been terraced and farmed like that, you guys, since the Romans came, long time ago. The reason is because the Romans paid their soldiers and their, people came with them with wine. So they were looking for places where they could do that. So you keep going, and it gets, the further up you get, the closer you're getting to Spain, and the drier it gets. So finally, you're getting to a place where you can grow really good grapes for red wine. And then the strangest thing happens. And we took a boat ride up the river, and I started to look up onto the hills, and I was like, this is strange. It's starting to look like Arizona. It got drier and drier, and and pretty much it turns into essentially like high desert, and I was like, oh my gosh, I just went 4,000 miles to get away from this. And I've come right back to the same place. For a moment, I had like a little strange quivering, like, what am I doing here? And then I was like, okay, I don't live up in this region. So instead, I just stepped back and I was like, let's just enjoy it. It's absolutely beautiful, And then you kind of come up and the river kind of comes to an end and you have to get off the boat because it gets too narrow. And you can take a bus up and you come up into this plateau. And essentially, you're in Spain. And there's this vast, flat, goes on for hours until you come to some pretty cool, beautiful cities. So there are parks all around, there are trees all around, there's water everywhere, old city, and it's a really strange mixture as a city. There's some really old, wonderful buildings, all mixed together with some, post-war, like we need to build whatever we can build fast buildings. And any number of them on any given street, you'll have a beautiful old building that's been rehabbed. And then next to it, you'll have a building that's completely falling apart. That's maybe from 200 years ago, and it looks like vampires live in it. There's just like, windows open and like birds there and cats living in it. And you're like, who owns this? And why is it in such state of disrepair? And one of the reasons is it's been a pretty poor country for a long time, because they had a dictator until I think 74 or somewhere like that, the Carnation Revolution. And so long story short, they also have some inheritance laws that make it so that when someone passes away, the property goes to the whole family, like everybody in the family, aunts and uncles, everybody, So in order to do anything with property, sell it, or whatever,
has to agree.
Everybody has to agree. So imagine how easy that is. This is
I
a culture that loves to talk. Like everybody loves to talk and talk a lot. And the language is really difficult. Falo um pouco de português, that's about the best line I can say, which means I can speak a little bit of Portuguese. That's what that means. It's a really beautiful city because there's an upper city in a sense and a lower city that's down by the river. And the upper city and the old city in particular, you kind of go across the city and you can go through all these churches and old city streets. And there's this place called the Boyao, which is a central market that just got redone. And it's really beautiful. And then you can kind of head downhill towards the river. It's about a 15-minute walk. And you get to a part where it can be really steep, like steps. You're taking steps down to the river. And it is like old stones where you're like, okay, this has been here for a really long time. Yeah. So, yeah, I would encourage you to come visit. It's a really wonderful place to stop in and enjoy. And then when you get into the countryside of Portugal, the roads are incredible. The highways are amazing. And very quickly you can be in a natural setting and you're like, why are there no people here? It's so beautiful. Yeah, it's a really unspoiled country. It's remarkable. So I'm very thankful for being here. The people are laid back, wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just one question from Pat. Is the Black Madonna revered in Portugal? You mentioned the Divine Feminine in churches.
It's certainly revered pretty close by in Spain, obviously, not too far away. But you have the Camino, the whole going to Santiago thing. Well, that's normally associated with Spain, but there's actually another one going all the way up the coast of Portugal. So it's actually part of that, and this sort of pilgrimage pathway has been here for a really long time, and you definitely run into the powerful influence of the Madonna. And then also keep in mind that Portugal is it's ancient Celtic, it's Roman. There's also Muslim background, Jewish background, and I don't know if it's Visigoths or but German background after they which think of Germanic tribes coming in, Teutonic tribes. So you have this incredible mix of people and languages. So the complexity of their language and the words they have available are really pretty remarkable.
It's because the Camino starts wherever people were. So it also starts in Ireland.
Yeah.
And you go to St. James's Gate in Dublin to get your little thing stamped, and then you walk down. And
Yeah.
and so it's, the Camino started wherever you started, wherever that was.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So if it was in the south of Portugal, then you went up.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a
Um,
wonderful church here. This is the Church of England. It's part of Europe, the European Church of England, that is dedicated to St. James, and it's open to all the pilgrims to come through.
yeah,
And it's actually, what's really interesting about it is that it's a Catholic country. So the English have been here for what, 400 years or something like that, right? So at some point they had a problem, which is that since they were Protestant, obviously Henry VIII, whole thing, they didn't have any place to bury anybody. So they had to bury them. They were burying them in, like, on the edge of the river and stuff, and it's like, because they couldn't be in a Catholic cemetery. So originally this church here was like a deal between the local Catholic diocese and whoever was in charge. And the English people are like, yeah, we need a cemetery. And they're like, okay, you can have this piece of land, whatever, here you own, everything. And they're like, now we want to build a church. And they're like, okay. This is during, like, the Inquisition and stuff. It's like, okay, you can do that, but you can't have a bell tower, and you have to have an enormous wall around the entire thing, which is still enormous. It's like 20 feet high, so that nobody can see there's a church there.
okay.
Yeah, and actually, it turns out to be an incredibly beautiful church with really wonderful acoustics, and so people come in, and they visit there, and people on the walk will visit, on the pilgrimage visit there. So it's really kind of neat, kind of woven into the culture. Yeah,
Oh, because Henry VIII banned pilgrimages.
yeah, yeah. Amongst many other things.
Oh, yeah. But
Yeah,
that
yeah, right.
you couldn't go on pilgrimage are really, really interesting. So, do you have I mean, I don't know how long are you there? I mean, are there
Yeah.
any fellow
So,
druids in Porto near you, and do you in a
yeah,
seed
I
group?
actually met one in. There's no seed group as far as I know nearby. I've only been here for about a year and a half. But when we were up, when I met you up at the Oxford Transpersonal Psychology, conference, I met a druid who lives nearby, which is great. And there are some down in Sintra, that whole area, and that's
Yeah,
only about a couple hours away or so. So just getting settled in here, and trying to get to know it. And we're on a long-term visa, and the goal is after 5 years to apply for citizenship.
great.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Excited.
So you've an interesting history. I'm not going to say
Thank you.
checkered, but interesting. Um, so I'm curious as to how, your story as to how you, I don't know what kind of background you come from in the US, but I suppose spiritually or religiously, but
Hmm.
how you found Druidry, and I
Druidry.
suppose, and then how you found Obod.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's a good story. It's because growing up on the East Coast, there's plenty of religious alternatives. But I grew up in Concord, Mass, not far from Walden Pond. Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the whole thing. But my mom's family were Episcopalians, which is the Church of England in America. But we didn't go. And my dad's family were Quakers, going all the way back, emigrated from, out north of York in England in the 1830s. But we didn't go to that either, because he had to go into Boston, and so there wasn't one in Concord, Mass, and Concord is the home of the American Revolution. So I grew up there, and I just grew up in the forest. My parents just got a lot of land and in that area at that time, and I just spent a lot of time in the woods. We had dogs. It's one of those places where you could just kind of open the doors and then you just let the dogs out. And so all 4 seasons, the snow, everything, and then left and went to Pennsylvania to go to school, and then went out to Arizona to go to grad school. And I was just going to stay for a couple of years to get a MFA in creative writing, and then stay for 30. But when I graduated from undergrad, I took 2 classes in religions when I was in school there. One was in Norse mythology, and one was in Tibetan Buddhism. And when I finished college, I was in university. I was like, wow, I finally get to read whatever I want to read.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I read Black Elk Speaks, which is this shamanic book. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. It's like a totally different worldview. And I had read some V.S. Naipaul about African, shamanism and that background. So I got out to Arizona to get this creative writing degree, and I immediately was surrounded by. You could see that there were definitely sort of shamanic traditions there. And this is 1993 or 1994, something like that. And I didn't, even at the time, this is before the idea of cultural appropriation was even really on most people's radar. But I had a sense of, like, this is not right for me. I need to figure out where I'm from, where my people are from. And so I really asked for at that time I was really communicating with the spirit world already just by asking for things, Didn't
Mm-hmm.
have a I didn't have a divination oracle deck or a tarot deck or anything like that then. And so I walked into this bookstore called Changing Hands. I said, just please send me what I need. And there was the Druid Animal Oracle, like shining on a, on a bookshelf. And I was like,
Calling you.
and
Yeah.
yeah, calling me. And it was the version that had the hawk on it, the
Yeah.
Merlin, the small hawk, which is perfect, right? So I took it home, I got it, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I started looking through, and a friend of mine had told me about there was also a Native American animal oracle. And so that's what got me thinking about it. And I was like, oh, I wonder if there's one for where, my family comes from in England. There it was. Started using it, looked in the back and was like, oh my gosh, there's a whole order, and there's no internet, there is, but there's no website or anything. Like I was sending off postage to get like,
That's right.
there was this, what I call the initial, like, if you're interested in this, and it's such a small advertisement in the back of the book. If you're interested in this, send us something and send us $20 or something, or we'll send you a bunch of stuff. And I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. It's, I was a little skeptical, even though the book was great. So then they sent it a month and a half later, whatever, this thing shows up. And I'll never forget, because as I opened the extra long envelope, because it's the British size of paper, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, and pulled everything out and everything. And I was just like, it's just beautiful. And I noticed immediately that the materials that were used were just beautiful. It's like, I don't even then, it might have been recycled paper. I don't really know. But there was this introductory pack or something. And I was immediately moved by that. And I was like, okay, something about these guys is special. And so then I just started doing that work. And then I joined. I mean, at the time I was in grad school and making a whopping $9,000 a year or something like that, teaching students, intro students, creative writing. And so that really began my journey. And while I was doing the Bardic grade, I was getting an MFA in creative writing. And then when I finished that, I needed to get a job. So I got a teaching job teaching poetry. And then I realized I really loved working with high school students, sort of 13 to 19. And I got asked to do admissions, and someone said, you should really be a counselor. And I was like, yeah, I should. And then I found this program, and I was like, I could go to get a counseling degree in adolescent counseling, which I did. And that's exactly the time I started the OVA grade.
Go
Is
away.
doing like healing and counseling and everything. And it was at that point I started to be like, oh, gee, interesting. Funny how things are lining up. And you know how it is as you're going through the grades, it's like stuff that you're reading starts to happen in the outer world.
That's right.
And then you stop, and then you're like, and then there's like that whole guilt, like, why aren't I moving forward? And then you come back and something happening in your outer world, suddenly you pick up the next course, and you're suddenly like, oh my gosh, here it is. It's exactly what's going on. And so there's this whole weird intermittent thing going on between the inner world and the outer world, which is, a form of teaching, obviously,
Yes.
from the inner world. And so I got through that program, and then the strangest thing happened, big surprise. I started the Druid grade, and all of a sudden, I had an opportunity to start my own school, leadership. And what is it? It's an art school. It's basically a school for bards, for
Wow.
all the performing artists, the visual artists, the whole thing. And a series of really kind of magical processes took place that put me in charge and allowed me to, it's a school that never should have survived, but I and everybody else who was involved in the beginning understood that there was something else in the inner world that was helping and protecting us. And that's a different story. I think it's been published, or that story's been on Philip's website or something like that.
Okay.
So I'm doing the Druid grade and started a school. And
Wow.
then, yeah, so 25 years of that. It's for 12 through 19-year-olds or so, it's about the max. All the art forms. And while I was there, taught created a poetry class called Poetry, Myth, and Magic. And that was fun. And it was a small class for, the older kids. And that's where I was able to kind of pour the accumulated knowledge and things that I was continuing to work with when I was done with OBOD. Once I'd gone through the Druid grade and then been a mentor for a little while. And then, and then I raised a family and all that kind of stuff happened. But the poetry class, Poetry, Myth, and Magic class, we called it, and the Art of Transformation really became the place where I kept learning and growing,
Mm-hmm.
because I learned so much from my students. And really what I was doing was teaching the class that I wish I could have had myself when I was their age.
Lovely.
Yeah, isn't that kind of cool? And then it was time to leave. I'd finished it was a school that was funded by the state, and so we were part of the state retirement system. And so after, we went through the pandemic, which was insane, trying to run an art school from home, uh, a
I
little
imagine.
crazy. Yeah, yeah. And so I started the Institute of Non-Dual Shamanism as a way to take what I had learned in my class and offer it to adults. And that began to happen. And then out of that, some of my former alumni joined that, and then other people I had met, began to join. And then out of that, I took all that knowledge and sort of turned it into the book, The Way of the Mystic Wizard. And then what's
Okay,
happening now is that's kind of growing into something.
I'm just going to put that into the chat. The way
The
of
Way of the
the
Mystic Wizard. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, I have a copy here. That's what it looks like. And I love
So
this cover. It's by
when was
Matthew
that
Spencer.
published? When was that published?
A couple years ago,
Okay.
2022 or something like that.
Okay.
And so basically, it's the accumulation of all the stuff that I had put together from my students in poetry, myth, and magic. And
Beautiful.
kind of put together. I had like a big box of stuff that I would use every year. And then things would get added, and I was like, okay, well, let's put it all together and see what we can do it, and what we can do with it. And then it's just started to grow. And I have a small group of people that I work with who are kind of like, I would call them inner world psychonauts. Like, we basically go into the inner world and explore. And there's about 10 of us, and we've been working together for about 8 years.
Okay.
And some of them, and actually this year is the first year that I'm doing teacher training for them, actually, so they can go out and do it wherever they want to do it. That's kind of
Brilliant.
cool, huh?
Brilliant.
Yeah, yeah. So that's my story. That's how I got here.
I just have a question. You know the school that you ran back
Yeah.
in Arizona, is that still running?
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's going great. It's called the Metropolitan Arts Institute. You can find it on the web at metro-arts.org. And if you're into education, in particular in arts, it's a great thing to check out, because go to this section on about, and then look at, go to and it'll have like mission and vision, and these are things I wrote, and then the philosophy, and you will see in it the influence of Druidry. I mean, it's all
What's the name
there.
of this? What's that website again?
Metro-arts.org. So
Metro
METRO
dash.
hyphen,
Yeah.
yeah, hyphen arts, ARTS.org. And if you go in there, I mean, I had to write the vision and the mission, and you'll see that it says essentially, ideally, art is the process of discovering the true self.
Yeah.
So I took in essentially a lot of the esoteric information that was coming from, that influenced me through Obad, and I was like, well, how can I offer this to the public in a way that's non-religious, in a way that is like
Yeah.
oriented around a bardic approach. So I would say things like, instead of using any kind of spiritual language, which we don't really need to use, I would say, like, look, you come to this art school and you're after discovering the source of your inspiration. There it is.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, every graduation, we would have graduation in this beautiful opera hall, and I would do the Druid prayer, the call for peace, at the beginning of the whole thing. And just like, so that was really, really cool. So it was a huge influence, and in a sense, it was a way for me to take everything that was a gift to me through Obad and bring it out into a very practical way into the world, so that kids who would, don't ever need to know about Druidry, be a part of Obad. It's just taking care of the bards in the city of Phoenix,
That's
all
right.
the artists and singers and performers, and it's still going on. Unfortunately, a guy came along who is the current head of school, and he had a wonderful background, and he totally understood what the school was about. And so, over a period of about 3 years, I trained him, and then he stepped into the role. And the last year I was there, he was the acting head of school, and I just kind of faded into the background, which is great.
I mean, that's such a wonderful achievement, is to, because people can set up wonderful projects and things, and then when they decide to leave, it dies with them or it doesn't carry on. So
Yeah,
that's why I
yeah,
asked you the
yeah,
question. Um,
yeah.
I
That
think
happens
it's
a lot,
wonderful.
Yeah, and actually, there's a term for it in schools. It's called founder's disease. And and so, I mean, fortunately, I was aware of it, almost 10 years before I was leaving, and I had, got a chance to talk to some people, and actually a couple people at a few schools who were actually struggling through it. And they were like, so I was like, give me what you got. And they were like, okay, so you need to begin to transition the entire school. And
Yeah.
deliberately, the last 7 or 8 years, when my staff would come to me, so like, my second level of administrators, and they would ask me for a solution to a problem and everything, I just started to reverse it all and be like, what would you do? What would you do? What would you do? And it just all began to switch, and if, whatever. I mean, obviously they could use me as a resource, but there comes a
Yeah.
point after, like, 19, 20 years of running an institution, you've pretty much seen every problem go by. It's just a different
That's right.
iteration of the same problem, right? uh, and so, yeah, the idea was to make it so that there was no dependency, that in fact the opposite would be, it'd be like this sense of like, who came in would be an improvement on myself. Be like, look, I was a founder type of person. I was really good at creating culture and stuff like that, and getting the school through stage 1 and 2 of nonprofit development. But the last stage of a nonprofit is a really refining stage. It's like, you just have to have this. Yeah, and the guy who took over, it's like he was perfect for it. He totally understood the culture, and he was ready to take it to the next level.
Mhm.
And I was tired. I was ready to go. I mean, we lived. I mean, I told someone the other day. I said, look, the first 16 years as an entrepreneurial organization, we didn't know if we would be open the next year. You just don't know. You just don't know. I mean, but you get to a point where eventually you build it. They have such a reputation that, you're like, okay, unless, Phoenix falls apart, we're going to have enough students. So I'm
Brilliant.
so grateful, because it gave me an opportunity to take what was hypothetical in a certain sense on the
Yeah.
Druid, and instead of me being like, how can I make that happen? I just offered myself to the universe and said, put me to work.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate that I was meditating, and I got a message that kind of said, just wait, it's coming. And I would never have expected that it would have become what it did, that it was going to be a school.
Wow.
I had no desire to run a school whatsoever. It's a lot of work.
Two lovely responses here. Ishfaq
Oh, cool.
Malik says, Matt Baker, well, such an inspirational and humble man, a true peacemaker. Michelle
Oh,
Blasky
sweet.
says, congrats on all of these achievements, Matt. I'm going for my MFA in creative screenwriting next year.
Oh, that's great.
So,
Congratulations. Go for it.
absolutely, absolutely. So, I suppose the question I often ask people is, okay, so there's been kind of a parallel process. Your external life, or
Yeah.
in the ordinary world, has been mirrored by your journey through the three grades. So,
Hmm.
have there been times when Druidry has supported you? You say, okay, this is what I'm
Mm.
tapping into, in addition to running your course and teaching, but in terms of your
Yeah.
personal life.
Yeah. I think that essentially, I mean, when I went out to Arizona and I realized I need to find this tradition that would bring me back to my own ancestors, I realized I was inherently like a spiritually oriented person. I was
Yeah.
interested in spiritual practice. I was in spiritual growth, psychology, and that, that the thing that Philip talks about is that place where psychology and spirituality interact.
Mm.
Those are really important for me, and I also became really interested in psychosynthesis and studied it. And so I think that what Druidry did is I eventually created a room for myself. I have one here in Porto as well, much like an artist has a studio. So it'd be like, it's a room with a view of like some trees and the whole thing. I mean, I lived in the desert and I'm from the forest. So this was a very
Yeah.
difficult place for me to live. I mean, every October I'd get really angry because it'd still be over 100 degrees, you know,
Yes.
and I'd be like pretty much angry at the weather. So what Druidry did is it kind of deeply validated my instincts. Since I didn't come from a church or a religious background, it was like, oh, my esoteric interests in mysticism and shamanism and all that kind of stuff were validated. And then what I did is I just kind of built it out myself. I eventually created an altar, I created a meditation space. And when I finished OBOD and moved on, I was really interested in mysticism. But I used my Druidry as the foundation for all of my spiritual inquiry. And so it kind of essentially, it's my connection to the inner world. And then everything else from there kind of flew from that. So ironically, I took those two classes in university, one in Norse, religion and mythology, and one in Tibetan Buddhism. And then like 20 years later, those two traditions became important So how perfect is that, right? So I ended up discovering Garchen Rinpoche, who lives just 2.5 hours north of where I lived in Phoenix, in Chino. And he's this incredibly beautiful, realized master, and who was inside of essentially a prison for 20 years in Tibet. And I wasn't, I wasn't even looking for Tibetan Buddhism. I just started having a dream of this dancing lady, 3 of them actually, a green one and a red one and a white one. And somebody who knew more than me said, "Oh, that's Tara." And I was like, "Who?"
Yeah.
And it was like, "Oh, that's White Tara." And I was like, "Oh, you should come see Garchen Rinpoche. That's Garchen Rinpoche's, um, the deity he works with." And I was like, "Okay, let's go do that." And that really changed my life, because that became my mystical training tradition. And that's not something, I mean, I don't speak Tibetan, or, and I wasn't a Buddhist at the time, but I ended up taking Buddhist vows, and, the Bodhisattva vows, and feeling connected to him, and particularly connected to White Tara, what it's called a Yidam deity, which is a meditational deity. And in a mystical state, you can go and connect with that deity, and she brings you a totally different view of reality, just deep, deep compassion. So that became really important, but it all kind of weaves back into where the foundation, because I have all the queries and the stuff that kind of takes you through, the rituals that take you through the year. And what I would find is I had different oracle decks and things like that. I would find it wasn't even tracking the seasons anymore. And inevitably what would happen is I'd come to one of the ceremonial times, and all of a sudden it would be like, go there and do that, like go to this particular book or do this, and it would remind me, and I'd be like, "Oh, it's the day of, time to do a ceremony." So it took me a long time to be okay with spontaneous intuitive ceremony.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took me a long time, basically to trust my intuition enough that I'm and connected to the inner tradition enough that the inner tradition would cue me up when it needed to happen. So, because I was pretty much a solo druid the whole time. And the only times I wasn't was when I flew to England and went on a retreat with Philip and stuff like that. So that helped.
Great. I have a question from Sean here.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, where has Druidry challenged you, not as an obstacle as such, but as a mirror or on perspective, etc.?
That's a good question. I think fundamentally, because Druidry is not a path of the book, it's not revealed religion. There was a long time where, I think probably in maybe the first 10 years or so, that I really wanted a little bit more solidity. I was like, I wanted to have more answers. I wanted to have a community. There's all kinds of things I really wanted that I think I could have gotten from a much more traditional religion. And I didn't get them.
Mm.
I was denied them. I tried, and I kept coming back and being like, "Nope, you're not going to find a whole circle of Druids." I was super jealous of everybody who lived in England. Envious is the correct word term, actually, or Ireland. And so Druidry challenged me to accept the conditions under which I found myself in my spiritual path, which was like sit there and burn in the desert, and build what I can in a harsh environment. And harsh environments have interesting impacts on mystical capacity. They can. So Druidry challenged me to stay in with the conditions and the insights and the variables that I was working with, like not having a seed group, or not having the 4 seasons, which I really would have liked, and not living in a beautiful place surrounded by trees and green, and not being in air conditioning all the time. There's all these things that are so not Druid, like the kind of the way I grew up,
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, I would say that my Druidry pushed me to be like, look deeper, look deeper, not just, and so Druidry is really oriented around, in many ways, nature mysticism, being in nature and then feeling the presence of. So since I was driving through these environments to get down to work in the center of Phoenix that were really miserable, like they were like a dilapidated street, with just like horrible architecture and stuff like that. Since all that was going on, I had to look deeper. And that's what drew me to actually non-duality and essentially formless mysticism. And formless mysticism is seeing and sensing the unity of everything no matter what you're looking at. Not no matter if it's ugly or pretty, or broken or man-made or natural made. And that was the only way. It was that path that actually helped me survive, ironically.
Did you
not
have a
getting what I
specific,
wanted.
did
Did I
you
have
did you
what?
have a did you have a specific key?
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
What was
So
it that helped you go deeper and all of that? I'm curious about how
I think
you
okay.
actually
So
did do
the
it.
key was I was in pain. I was so horrified by the uglification of the world and the impact that humanity had had, and I just like I was like, okay, I either have to leave, and I couldn't leave. I created a school. It's just like I get that I'm meant to be here, like I'm at service, but why do I have to be in so much pain all the time about it? And emotionally or whatever. And so I was like, there must be another way. And so I asked, and then a book from Ken Wilber, a great integral philosopher who lives in Colorado, showed up, and I started studying him and everything. And then he has this whole thing that lays out the different kinds of mysticism. And I was like, so what is this formless mysticism he's speaking about? And I was like, because I was familiar at that point with deity mysticism and nature mysticism. I used to go and sit under this tree in Peace Park and like room and meditate, and it was beautiful. And the grass would wave to me and ripple, and I was like, oh, this is fabulous. And I'd be like, yeah, and I'm living in like the wasteland, I used to call it, like where I was driving through the wasteland to get down to my school, which was also in the wasteland. So when I began to look deeper, I was like, oh, so there is a way. So then I asked for a tradition to come in. I said, come teach me formless mysticism. I don't get a teacher. I don't have a path. I don't have a way. I live in kind of, Phoenix was not the spiritual center of the United States. That was like Boulder was, which was like, a 2 hour, flight. And I was like, why isn't my school in Boulder? I literally would have those questions, and a wiser man than me eventually finally said, like, look, man, you're doing the real work in a really difficult place. That's why you're there. You're making a much bigger impact. Boulder's fine. It's got Naropa,
Yeah,
it's got all
yeah.
these other things, and I was like, okay. So it's not about getting what I want. It's about making a difference. So what I eventually found was through a friend of mine, there's a non-dual awakening tradition called Ascension and the Ishayas. And it turned out one of the Ishaya monks lived in Tucson. And so she came up and she did a workshop, and I took the workshop and the whole thing. And at some point she took me aside and she said, she gave me these techniques and I started using them. And then just stuff happened. I had non-dual mystical breakthroughs. That makes it sound really simple, but it really isn't. There were a lot of outer world conditions that conspired to put pressure on me at that time in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And if they hadn't been like that, I wouldn't have been ripe for those breakthroughs. So I ended up reading what are called pointing out instructions. With the first time they were ever written down by Ken Wilber in his book called The Eye of Spirit. And I was so angry at them that I threw the book across the room and ended up sort of seeing through part of consensus reality. And so that's kind of where that became useful for me, because then even I was kind of laughing hysterically for 3 days after that. The point was I was then able to begin to move into the world and be like, oh, spirit is everywhere. And for the first time, I could see that and sense it and not feel longing, but feel complete.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're a nature mystic, it's classic. You go out, you're sitting on the end of the ocean and you have this feeling of longing, and then you connect with the sea and you're like, yeah, I'm home. Yeah. So I learned to be able to do that, driving down through the wasteland. I could look back and I could see it smiling back at me. So, and I needed it. I don't know if I would have made it otherwise.
Oh, that was so beautiful. And we're coming
Thank you.
close to the end of our piece on this platform. But another question: with Buddhism emphasizing enlightenment, does Druidry for you have specific or a better word that would address enlightenment?
Yeah, I think the word enlightenment is kind of today is a little like it's almost not really particularly helpful. It's like an early version of translations of whatever. So the term that's actually most effective, and I love it, is awakening.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
because awakening is essentially almost like nature awakening every morning when the sun comes up. Okay, when you wake up in the morning, you wake up from. Okay, so the basic concept of awakening is that and people use it all the time now. And they use the idea of pure awareness and awakening. And what's beautiful about it is that we've been awakening our whole lives. So there's a point where we awaken from mythic consciousness to rationality as a child. And there's a loss. There's a loss when that happens, and there's a gain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite remarkable as it happens. You go from a childlike mythic consciousness, and you can go back and reintegrate some of that. But the same thing happens around what people will call traditional kensho or awakening experiences. So we have consensus reality that, Eimear and Matthew are here and all the other people are there. And it's like, okay, and that's, and it's true. And it's like, and we're also sharing the same awareness. There's really, and this busts people's ideas, but it's basically like in a consensus reality, we'd all be separate people, and we are, and we're also all using exactly the same awareness to communicate. And awakening to that viscerally is as powerful as awakening from mythic consciousness to rational consciousness. It upends your reality as much. And our species, my sense is our species is going through a mass process where more and more people are having that experience and being able to describe it. So I moved a long time ago, probably 20 years ago, away from the word enlightenment towards awakening, because it's also a process.
Yeah.
It's not like it solves your problems. Just like moving from mythic consciousness to rational, it doesn't make it so that suddenly, you're still not like whatever you are, an egocentric 8-year-old, still having your you're pulling your sister's hair or whatever, all that's still going on. So it's just it's a cognitive breakthrough. And then after the cognitive breakthrough, that can be experienced in through the heart, or it can open in the heart first. And either way, the goal is to open the heart and the mind. And they each can be difficult for their own reasons, obviously. Wow. So I would say, yeah, awakening is a better term, because I love it. It's sort of like a seed opening, turning towards pure awareness.
It is beautiful. Owen says, I'm thankful for the key question. I'm curious of what was the way into the deeper. Listening to your response, do you think your practice is primarily in you or in the land and space about you? Or how is it knitted?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So, Owen, I'd say it's a little bit of both. So, for instance, I think the key for me, what stands out in what you just said, is the word space. So my practice is actually in the spaciousness or the space around me. And so it's as if that space itself is awake. And I can either be aware of that or not. So like right now, I'm not aware of it. I'm paying attention to Eimear and we're talking, and now I am aware of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when that happens, I usually have nothing else to say, which is rare for me.
Which actually, what's really nice is it brings that's a night now that you're silenced. Can we end with, because we're going to go over to the heart now, and I know there are other questions in the chat, so those of you could come over into the heart and we can ask those questions on that space in a few moments. But having been a teacher of poetry for 100 years, would you like to share one of your creations, please?
Yeah, sir. I wrote this poem a few days ago. I didn't know what it was going to be about. So I'll read it to you. And as I read it, David White, as he reads stuff, I might repeat one of the stanzas as I read it, or one of the lines,
sure.
Just so you have a sense of it. Okay, so this is called Poem for the Stone in Me. Today I walk toward the bridge, and this stone I wear is like an extra hand. Today I walk toward the bridge, and this stone I wear is like an extra hand that has grown wrongly, always pointing at an invisible moon. Yesterday, I was afraid that the sky would cave in. Yesterday, I was afraid that the sky would cave in and I would be the only one left. So I relented softly, the way a leaf can, call out to its fallen siblings that someday soon I will willingly die too. That someday soon I will willingly die too. Being alone here on this day is okay. If only because I will wake tomorrow, get to the business of coffee and shopping, dogs out walking, gulls flying, the wind turning the tops of the fluid trees, rustling. The wind turning the tops of the fluid trees, rustling. Standing here or there would be fine without you. Without the me I once was, the we once were. Aloneness you suddenly see is always not the worst drink, but rather a drink you sip slowly to remind yourself of the deep, deep thirst, to remind yourself of the deep, deep thirst that you have for all the days to come, whatever and whoever they are. Thank you, everybody.
Beautiful. So, what a lovely conclusion to our chat. So, I'll let you say goodbye and then let the members of the order just move over to the hearth and we'll continue the discussion. So, if you could say good night and then I'll just.
Okay. Hey, good night, everybody. Thanks very much. It's wonderful to be with you. And till next time, whenever that is.
Just beautiful responses to your poetry.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful poem. I'm astonished. That was wonderful, beautiful poetry. So
thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll see you in a few minutes and I'll just say goodbye to everybody here. So thank you all for joining us this evening. And I will look forward to, well, I suppose good morning. If those of you are here in the morning, good evening. Have a wonderful day, or if you're watching a recording of this chat. And I look forward to seeing you next week for another Fireside Chat. So be well. And as we continue into the dark half of the year, take care of yourselves. Slán.